Welcome back. The life of a foreign minister is not all beer and skittles. Can you just imagine all of that travel, all of those time zones, the jet lag that must engulf you from time to time? Bob Carr only got back into Australia in the last day or so, and I was very pleased that he gave some time to me this morning. So late this morning I recorded this interview. Here it is. Bob Carr, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
It's hard to know where to start. There are so many issues, but let's start with our nearest neighbour, New Guinea. Now, when you were last on the program, you were talking about the need for an early election and to get things done. Since then, there's been incredible turmoil in New Guinea politics. I don't understand at all how high courts can rule that the person who has the numbers in the parliament shouldn't be the PM, and all these things are strange. Where does it all stand now?
I'd give them time, and I say when I speak of Papua New Guinea that they've completed something that they ought to be praised for. You've got the most ethnically diverse country in the world, according to some tests. You've got this diverse topography. You've got a rough and ready political process by Australian standards, but they did it. They adhered to that 5-year election schedule. And as a result, they can stand up in the United Nations or in the Commonwealth and say, we can adhere to democracy with all these challenges and problems. Others can do it. I prefer to emphasise the positive in what came out of their election. And despite all the attention to things that went wrong, and I agree that by Australian standards their democracy is rough and ready, it wasn't as bad as previous elections.
Now, what about Peter O'Neill? What's the situation? Where do we stand? What do we think of Peter O'Neill?
Well, it's not up to us to pick and choose. Now, that's a choice that this independent country is engaged in. We've got to leave it to their processes, as different as they may be from ours. But the positive thing I will comment on this is that there is an active civil society in Papua New Guinea, and it reflects increasingly educated electorate and one that's taking an interest in good governance. And I think we can take hope in that.
What about the lawlessness? Because that is rampant. You can't walk down a street safely anywhere in New Guinea. What can ever be done?
As friends of Papua New Guinea, we've got to be concerned about that. And our best response to it is to continue the development assistance we give them, and we give them on a fairly generous scale. But we do so because we've got an obligation to them. They're entitled to it, given our responsibility for the country pre-independence. One thing that I came across the other day looking at our aid program that I think is very hopeful, women have had a marginalised role in the society of Papua New Guinea for the most part. They themselves would say it. As a result of a specific Australian aid program, the number of women magistrates in Papua New Guinea has gone from 7 to 700. Now, the village magistrates. And if you can get women exercising authority at the village level, then they make decisions about violence against women, about women's rights, and eventually you've got a society that can contemplate women in decent numbers being part of its parliament. That's a relatively small program, but it's useful in seeing the maturation of their society.
Well, now, you've always been a great election campaigner. I think we have to say there are a few in Australia who can claim your success rate. And so I'm accustomed to you entering the fray, but not really in a US election. that tended to surprise me just a tad.
Yeah. I spoke to Kim Beazley, our ambassador in Washington today, and I said, thank you for getting the meeting with Romney. There are other countries that would have noticed. It was the Australian Foreign Minister who got a meeting with the about to be confirmed Republican candidate for president. I said to him, we started the meeting by talking about our experience running the Olympics. He was here during the Sydney Games in 2000. He went on to transform the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City. He did a great job. We spoke about things you'd be familiar with, ticketing, Olympic ticketing, down to the details, and then got on to how the role Australia was playing in Afghanistan. I wanted to brief him on that. But as we ended the meeting, I said, I just want to encourage you. I think America's best days are to come. The one thing needed to banish talk of American decline is a deal on the budget to bring the debt and deficit under control. And I'd said that in the past to Americans, and Americans,
sounds reasonable.
Yeah, and Americans like that message. When I said it to Bob Zellick when he was head of the World Bank, I was very flattered. He ended up quoting me on CNN and has quoted me in numerous speeches in America. I get to hear about them from time to time. He says, Bob Carr, the Australian Foreign Minister, a great friend of America, says the one thing we've got to overcome is our big problem with debt and deficit. We need a deal on Capitol Hill after the election that brings that under control by tackling entitlement reform and tax reform. And far from being a criticism of America, it's a vote of confidence in America. They've got the technology, they've got a revival of manufacturing that's going to become more competitive. They've got great universities, and they're achieving, this is very important, energy independence. The one thing they've got to fix is the obvious.
Indeed. All right, let's move on to the Middle East. We've got all sorts of problems there. First off, Syria. There's no intervention in Syria. Massacres are now happening on an almost daily basis. They're saying 10,000 killed already. At what point does the West say enough?
It's very, very difficult. You need the sanction of the Security Council to mount any sort of intervention, even to have sanctions that are applied by the 190-odd members of the UN as a group. At the present time, the EU, the US, nations like Australia are applying sanctions of various kinds to Syria, but to choke them economically and force the regime to a ceasefire and negotiations would take sanctions under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter by all members. Now, even that failed. And as a result, we're in a terrible period where, in the words of President Hollande of France, speaking at the Friends of Syria meeting in Paris that I attended for Australia, you're looking at an escalation of massacres. An escalation of massacres.
And you're saying that we're powerless then? There's nothing that can be done?
Under international law, unless there's a coalition of the willing out there, and no one is keen on that because of the formidable military exercise involved, harder than Libya by a long shot.
This is because Syria has a more advanced weaponry system. It's got better air forces.
They've got as they confirmed in shooting down a Turkish aircraft, very formidable surface-to-air defences, a very experienced military that has been fine-tuned in anticipation of war spilling over from Lebanon or a war with Israel, highly trained. Nothing like the situation in Libya.
So do we just watch? Do we just turn on CNN and turn on Fox and just watch it happening day after day?
That's a fair question. There's a checklist of what can be done. Humanitarian assistance to see that wretched people, 1 million refugees by some estimates, 1 million people who've had their houses bombed, which is a frightful thing to imagine.
But there's wholesale bombing of suburban neighbourhoods.
I know.
But how indiscriminate can you get?
I know, and there's the frightening prospect of the country, one of a handful in the world that admits to having chemical weapons, and having chemical weapons that have already been mixed and placed in artillery shells, moving those, and some dread, moving those in anticipation of using them. This is a regime that in the 1980s shelled insurgents and killed thousands of them. At the very least, we've got United Nations monitors there, so we have some ears and eyes in the country, although it's dangerous for them to move around as comfortably as you would want. The United States and other nations are looking at providing non-lethal assistance to the opposition. The French are working on easing, and others are working on easing the disparate Syrian opposition towards a cooperative relationship that involves them having a plan for political transition. The last thing we want, should Assad be removed and a replacement figure come in to head the regime and to start negotiations, the last thing we'd want would be the opposition to fragment. We want them to get a common set of demands in anticipation of being part of a transitional governing council.
Unfortunately, they do fragment pretty easily over there. Look, one last question. If there was to be a transition, if you finally were able to get rid of Assad, where would he go? If there's any country in the world that would take him, where he would feel safe from prosecution? Because if he's going to resign, he's got to have some safe haven, has he not? Well,
I'm certain that the Russians have been asked to consider that by the Americans and the hours of negotiations between the two. One thing is pretty clear out of the summit in Geneva and the very useful communique that emerged from it about this question of political transition in Syria is that there is a disinclination or an opposition to him being given immunity or impunity. As a wordsmith, you'd appreciate there is a subtle distinction between the two concepts, but they're very close to the same, immunity or impunity. I don't think the world would be inclined to do that to him. If there are crimes, he will be held accountable for them, and on the evidence that's emerged, it seems likely there have been some category of war crimes, mass crimes, crimes against humanity.
All right, last topic, Libya. I want to congratulate you. That was a tremendous personal success in getting Melinda Taylor and her colleagues out. You obviously put a lot of your own reputation on the line. There was much at stake personally for you, but it worked. How did it ever happen? How could representatives of an international court finish up being arrested?
Because of the political mess in Libya, or I should say more diplomatically, because of the fragile and complex politics of a country that had had a shocking dictatorship overthrown. And it meant that central authority is challenged by other entities. And we had no clear idea of the agenda of the Zintan militia and of how close or otherwise they were with the government in Tripoli. But in the end, they kept her and the others in decent circumstances. I was pleasantly surprised by that. But it can only be explained by the hatred that exists for the very name of Gaddafi, and in that context, some misunderstanding involving the protocols and procedures of the International Court and the expectations of the militia that is now the government in Zintan.
That's the problem too. You mentioned about fragmentation. In Libya, there's no real central authority, is there?
Well, there have been elections that by all accounts were successful in giving them a body that will frame the new constitution. There are challenges, it seems, to the government in Tripoli coming from Benghazi. There's a recrudescence of tribalism, a lot of tensions the country's got to resolve. There'd been recruits from sub-Saharan Africa used in Gaddafi's army, and they face a lot of public hostility. There's some tension between the Arab and the non-Arab components of the population. But I was very impressed by the Prime Minister and the Deputy Foreign Minister in my conversation. They were very open, they were accessible to me at all times, and they're people with some status and standing in their own country who are engaged in this awesomely difficult task of leading Libya beyond the debauchery and degradation and deformity of a decades-long dictatorship.
Yeah, impossible task.
It's got no judicial system, for example.
Tony Abbott, talking tough on China. What does it all mean?
I think it's very worrying. If he were to become Prime Minister, an immediate conflict with Indonesia because of his broad brush policy, tow the boats back, just let them loose in Indonesian waters. In China, he's saying things that the Chinese would interpret as very hostile. Now, we've got Chinese companies investing in Australia, sustaining in mining directly 5,000 jobs. Now, if he's saying you won't have a shot of investing in Australia if you're a state-owned company, he's saying we'll lock out Chinese investment. The Chinese could turn around and say, but hang on, we're buying 1/4 of your iron ore, 60% of your iron ore, 1/4 of your coal. Are you friendly or not? I'm worried too that he would have Australia take a stand in the territorial dispute in the South China Seas.
Which doesn't seem to me to have much to do with us.
No. We've got an interest in it being resolved peacefully. I've said that. We've got an interest in it being resolved in accordance with international law and specifically the law of the sea. I've said that. But I've repeatedly said that we take no stand on the competing claims. Now, the Chinese would see it as remarkable if an Australian Prime Minister... Look, I'd put it this way. If Tony Abbott implemented these policies and started burbling about the Anglosphere as Prime Minister, that is, sending a message that we're more comfortable talking to the English-speaking nations, the white guys, we would go back... I mean, the problems we had in John Howard's first year when Pauline Hanson was running amok and when we had difficulties with China would be nothing compared with this supercharged disaster, Tony Abbott.
Bob Carr, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks,
I
Graham.
wish you well. I hope you have time enough to continue this work.
Terrific, thank you.
Okay. The time enough remark, of course, is just how long does this government last? One thing's for sure, I've known Bob Carr since 1968. He's lasted well. He's still doing a terrific job. I am an unabashed fan. No doubt about that.